Namaste, and welcome to our class series on the art and science of Raja Yoga. My name is Nayaswami Jaya, and I would like to begin our class series with a brief introduction to the first two chapters in the art and science. The first chapter is the history of yoga, and the second chapter is the paths of yoga. I hope most of you have read the autobiography of a yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda, and if you have, you'll remember that in 1920, he was invited to visit the West, Boston in this case, to give a lecture as a representative of India to a Congress of Religious Liberals. For this congregation, people had been invited from all the major religions, and Yogananda was invited to represent India and its spiritual tradition. And interestingly, when he gave his discourse, it was very well received. He spoke not of Hinduism, which some people might have expected. He didn't speak about the Vedas. He didn't speak about anything that was, you might say, culturally identified with India. Instead, he took as his theme something universal, something that applied to everybody. He used the title, The Science of Religion. And this was a novel approach because people didn't think of religion in those days, and perhaps even not now, as a science. It was something that was based upon belief, it was based upon scripture, it was based upon passed down tradition, but a science? It was a novel approach. But Yogananda felt that in this age, and in that day, 1920, was the beginning, in the sense, of a new age. The war had just concluded and society was ready for something new. He felt in this age, people no longer wanted to live their lives based upon simply belief. It wasn't enough, and particularly where he found himself at that time in the West, in America, which is a very practical country. People wanted something more. They wanted something that they could apply in their daily life. They wanted something that they could test and they could see for themselves. One of Yogananda's first disciples in America was a man by the name of Dr. Lewis. He was a dentist, and it was shortly after that discourse that he approached Yogananda with the question on the very first meeting. He had studied the Bible as a young man and was a religious man, but he didn't completely understand the scriptures, the Bible scriptures. And he posed a question to Yogananda. He said, "It said in the Bible that if thine eye be single, thine whole body will be full of light." And he said, "I've read this many times and I just don't understand what that means. Can you explain the meaning of this?" And Yogananda had invited him to his apartments at that time and asked him in. And after a few preliminary questions, when asked if he could explain this, he said to Dr. Lewis, "Yes, I think I can." But he didn't explain it from the position of, well, it means this, it means that, and the eye is the spiritual eye, and if it's single, and so on. None of that. What he did is he asked Dr. Lewis to sit before him, and he placed his forehead. Now, remember, this was their first meeting, so that was a bit of a strange thing to do, I'm sure. He placed his forehead against Dr. Lewis's forehead, and Dr. Lewis saw this brilliant light here at the point between the eyebrows. And he went for quite a long time into a state of ecstasy. And he knew. And there was no more explaining had to be done. What does it mean if thine eye be single? Because he had experienced for himself. And on some deep soul, perhaps unconscious level, there's a sense, and Yogananda had that society is asking for something more now. People have read the scriptures and their guides and their wonderful messages of how we should conduct our life, but they hint at something more that each of us recognize, that there's something transcendent that all of us are seeking. And now is a time to know. The time for knowing God has come, as Yogananda said. And we need to approach this in a systematic way. We can approach it as a science. And Yogananda brought that perspective of religion to that Congress of Religious Liberals. And he was very well received. And he continued from there to spread that message throughout America and to great reception. He was filling halls. And since that day, this message has gone out to the world at large. You could say that the science of yoga that he introduced at that time in Boston could also be described as the science of soul freedom. It's a science in the sense that there's a step-by-step method that if we follow these steps, we will be able to attain that state of freedom. Now, freedom from what? Freedom from the delusion that this world is the ultimate reality, freedom from the various bondages, freedom from bad habits. Eventually, you could say freedom from egotism, this idea that you and I are separate beings, that we do not have something in common, that our essential nature is individualistic, one from the other. This consciousness of egotism and separation is, you could say, the source of many of our problems in life. And the science of yoga is helping us to be able to transcend that sense of egotism. And so Yogananda could have approached his discourse from that perspective. In the Indian tradition, this is called Sankhya philosophy, the reason why we will never find our ultimate freedom out in this world. He could have approached it from that direction. And yoga that's an important part of the yoga philosophy, or the science, the philosophy behind the science, but he didn't. He approached it from another perspective, which I find very inspiring. What he shared was, this is a science. It's testable. It's repeatable in the laboratory of your own direct experience of religion. He gave techniques how to do that. These are the techniques of Raja Yoga, the techniques of meditation. He gave exercises. He gave all of that. But then he held out a vision and he asked the question, we do this, but what are we seeking? Now the religionist might say, well, we're seeking God. But what does that mean to the average person? If you think we're all seeking God, and I suspect that we've heard that said before, but how do we apply that into our daily life to make sense of that? And this is how Yogananda approached the subject. He said, all of us here from all of these traditions, East and West, this religion, that, we're all seeking the same thing. God, perhaps you could describe it as that. But let's bring it down an octave. All of us are seeking happiness. Isn't that so? If you look in everything that you do, and if you want a happy family life, you want a happy material life, you want the better job, the better career. Why? Because you feel it'll make you happier. It says everybody is motivated by this quest for happiness, or concomitantly on the other reverse side, certainly at least to avoid suffering. And that's perhaps how the Buddha would have described it. But we're seeking happiness. And he went on to explain that people mistake happiness for circumstances. They think that if I do this or if I do that, this circumstance or that is going to lead me to the happiness that on some deep level my heart is seeking. And we pursue it, and we find that yes, we're happy for a little while, but in the end, no, it didn't quite give us what we wanted. And so we pursue it over here. And yes, it's a little bit, it's temporary, but again, it doesn't last. And we then begin to think, well, I need to change my circumstances. And so we go outside of ourselves to arrange the circumstances. If I have it all, everything in my life in place, I'll then be happy. And we see, no, that too. Even the most perfect of circumstances eventually becomes boring. We want something new. So we're always outwardly seeking. What Yogananda explained, and what the saints and sages of all traditions have explained, that yes, it's good to seek happiness, but the happiness we really want is not out there. It's something that is eternal within ourselves, and that's what each of us are seeking. Swami Shankara, the ancient sage of India, the founder and the modern founder of the Swami order, he explained it and described it in a way that Paramahansa Yogananda liked to use, and I found it very helpful to think of it in this way as well. He explained what we're all seeking is Sat Chit Ananda. Ever existent, ever conscious, ever new bliss. And that's what we really want. And that is the soul's true nature. And we've gone out from that soul to seek it elsewhere, when all along what we're really seeking is deep within our own selves. But it's hidden, it's obscured, it's veiled. And our task in life is to uncover that, to remove those veils, to find the essence of who and what we truly are. And you have the goal of life to seek happiness, bliss, and you have the reason why you're not going to find it there. But what's missing in between those two is the question of how. How can we go? It's not there, but how can we find it there? And that is what yoga is about. And that is the practice of those techniques, that process, to be able to move from point A to that vision of point B, is the science of yoga. And it is a science because it's testable. As we practice and as we study these lessons to come, I ask you to not go simply by belief. Yes, I believe it to be true. I have faith it's to be true. A great master said it was true. That's a starting point. But we must take it to the next step, which is to make it real for ourselves in our own individual understanding. And the process of doing that is a removing of those things that obscure our vision. Many years ago, I had the privilege of meeting a number of times a disciple of Swami Shivananda, who was a realized master of the mid-20th century. And one of his disciples was, by chance, his name was Swami Satchidananda. And he was a wonderful man, and he's now passed. But he would, I remember when I first met him the very first time, he gave a discourse on disease, spiritual disease. And he says, if you break down the word disease, it's dis-ease, not ease. And I always remembered that because it said ease is our natural state. Ease is who and what we are, the state in which we live naturally. But dis-ease is anything that disturbs that natural state. And so consequently, dis-ease is physical disease, but mental disease, emotional disease, all disharmonies, disharmony. Harmony is the natural state. Disharmony is the unnatural state. Egotism is the unnatural state. Oneness is our natural state. And we find through the practice of techniques, through the practice of yoga, through learning to attune ourselves to some higher reality, that we slowly begin to uncover. Yoga was defined by a great saint, a great sage of a couple thousand years ago by the name of Patanjali, who wrote the Yoga Sutras. And in those sutras, he describes yoga as the process of smriti, memory, learning to remember our true state. And that memory will naturally arise. It comes of its own as we begin to uncover it. And so it's not so much of an acquiring of new knowledge, but revealing an ancient knowledge that is ours already. The science of yoga is an ancient science. It's actually said to have been handed down to us from a higher age. Higher, I don't know if it's technologically higher, but certainly in terms of awareness, that in ancient times, awareness was expanded. Swami Sri Yukteswar, Paramahansa Yogananda's guru, explained that mankind's awareness of subtler realities, realities within himself, go through cycles of up and down and through very complicated reasons, which I can't go into here, but our awareness increases, mankind as a whole, society as a whole, and increases in waves. And we happen to be in a bit of a downward wave right now. And so our awareness of reality is through material form, material outwardness, physicality, through the senses. But in a higher age, we begin to see the reality behind the physical world. And Swami Sri Yukteswar said one of the tests of whether or not we're moving into a higher age is when mankind as a whole begins to perceive subtler energies behind this physical world. And if we look in the realm of science, we see that that actually is true right now. But in previous times, though, it's said that yoga descended from when man's awareness was more refined than it is now, and it has been passed down from that ancient tradition. And you could say that yoga is as old as people have been trying to discover these ancient truths, and as old as mankind has been able to pass these truths down in a systematic fashion. And this is one of the beauties of the Vedic tradition, the Indian tradition, that truths have been discovered through individual effort of the saints and sages and the ancient rishis, have been passed down in a systematic way again and again and again, from one generation to the next. Whereas in many cultures, that tradition, these things have been discovered again and again because they are universal principles. They're not the possession of any one culture or people. They are possession of mankind as a whole. But yet, in other traditions, that tradition sometimes has been broken. Whereas in the East and India particularly, it's been an unbroken tradition passed down from ancient times. And it's testable for each one of us. And this is the science of yoga that we're going to be studying in these coming lessons. The yoga science is traditionally, when we approach it, each of us, we must understand, has a unique personality. We're not made like a cookie cutter, each one of us just like the next. I'm different from you and you're different from your spouse. But we can generally define people as according to broad categories. In yoga, its approach to the science needs to be presented in a way that will reach everybody, even depending upon what their individual personality is like. And so yoga is broken into these various traditions, and there are three primary ones, and these are called the yogas of personality. One is for those people who are more devotional by nature. They're more from the heart. They don't go by so much the rational mind. They don't think in terms of philosophy and that side of things, but they love. And they realize that in loving, they attain that which they want. And love, of course, brings about a state of unity. Love transcends the differences between one person and another, and we feel that when we truly feel love in the heart. And so this approach to the spiritual path is known as Bhakti Yoga. And there are many practices and many traditional techniques by which we can increase that devotional call of the soul to bridge the gap between this sense of division, this sense of distance from me as an individual embodied soul in an ego to that universal Sat Chitananda. What does yoga mean? And it's derived, its literal meaning is union. And love brings about a union. Then so that union can be approached from the heart, Bhakti Yoga. But it has to be an inward approach, an inward devotion, an inward love. So often we start with outward expressions of devotion, and we see this in all traditions. All religious traditions have that aspect of prayer, chanting, and outward expressions that sometimes are somewhat emotional even. That outward expression ultimately must be taken into the deeper side of our devotional nature. So Saint Teresa of Avila wrote that my prayer has gone so deep that now I cannot even pray with words. It went beyond the outer into a deep inner longing until we bridge that disunion and attain that state of yoga or union through the approach of love. So this is one, the Bhakti Yogi approaches in this direction. But all of us, remember, all of us have that side of within us as well. The second side is for those people who tend to be a little bit more of the rational nature. And this side is said to be Jnana Yoga. We want to understand. It's a little bit more philosophical, a little bit more rational. We use the tool of discrimination, not this, not that. But if not this, not that, what is? And so we try to understand truth. It's a path more of wisdom, you might say. But wisdom is more than simply the brain. Wisdom is more than the intellect. Wisdom also must embrace intuition, which transcends the mental faculties. Intuition is the direct perception of truth without the intermediary faculties of the senses. And so here we have a direct reference to what meditation is. Meditation is the practice of having the direct perception of truth without the sensory intermediaries. And so the Jnana Yogi approaches more from that side. But we know if left just to that side, it can become dry. So you find people that are very intellectual, but they have no heart. And you're not going to make progress that way. On the other hand, you can have the Bhakti Yoga who's all heart, but no brain. And that too is not good. There must be a balance. We have to use common sense, whether we're devotional as our nature or whether perhaps a little bit jnanic, intellectual is our nature. We bring these into balance because each of us possesses both sides, and in harmony is the best. And the third branch of these three yogas is, whether we're Bhakti Yogi or Jnana Yogi, we must act. We act in life. And so we find this is the nature of some people, that perhaps they're not highly of the rational sort, the Jnana Yogi sort, and perhaps the devotional side is not their side, but they want they want to act in life, get on with it, and the Karma Yoga side is that. But each of us, whatever our disposition, we must act in life. And the mistake the Karma Yogi makes sometimes is he thinks it's of the outer action itself, the doing of certain specific defined things, is the measure of his Karma Yoga. So the Karma Yogi says, well, my job is to serve, and so I'm building a hospital. Now, it's a good thing. Or a school, that's a good thing. Whatever, if we're going to do something, we might as well do something good. But it's not the outer thing that we do. It's not what we do. It's how we act. So karma yoga is action without the desire for the fruits of action. It's action with the right attitude. It's acting in life as an instrument of the higher Satchidananda, that divine self, and not acting as an instrument of the ego. Because as we'll learn in these lessons, when we act as an instrument of the ego, there's action, reaction. It's binding. This is what binds us. We act from personal motivation. We act from the personal expectation of reward, and even a good action, when you have that attitude, is binding. And this is karma. And this is what draws the soul back again and again. So whatever our disposition, we must learn to act in the proper manner. Act with the proper attitude. And so but you find people, if you look, you'll see that one person is of a certain nature, another is of another nature, but you will also see that all of us have all three of these approaches within each one of us. Raja Yoga is the science of how to approach life consciously, and embraces all three of these yogas of personalities, and adds the science of meditation and the techniques that accompany that. Raja Yoga uses as its reference the scriptures of Patanjali, his Yoga Sutras. And in the Yoga Sutras, which are a discourse on the science of Raja Yoga, Patanjali describes a step-by-step process through which all souls proceed to this goal of self-realization. This is the natural and ultimately our destiny for everyone to move in this direction, because it's what all of us on the deepest level of our souls want, is this state of self-realization. So this is the science of Raja Yoga. So we'll be studying all of these aspects, and including those techniques, to allow us to take a step-by-step pathway to our goal. I'd like to mention one further yoga, and that's Hatha Yoga, because Hatha Yoga is the physical branch, you might say, the physical side of Raja Yoga, of yoga meditation, and it needs to be understood properly in relationship to that science of meditation, because many people these days, they practice Hatha Yoga, which is a wonderful thing to do, and I'm all for it, but they forget its relationship to the larger goal, which is self-realization, the experience of that divine Satchitananda. That's why we train the body. That's why we do this. Remember, all of us are seeking happiness. So a physical body that's well-shaped and a physical body that's healthful, this will engender more happiness, as it certainly can, but that's not the goal. The goal is something that's transcended. It's not happiness just through the physical body. It's learning to go beyond the physical to something deeper. And so the true purpose of Hatha Yoga, as defined by Patanjali in the Yoga Sutras, is to be able to develop ourselves to the point where we can keep the body still in right posture. And that right posture is sitting with the straight spine. And that's all that Patanjali mentions. But the implications of that have been developed into the science of Hatha Yoga. And so we'll discuss a little bit about that as well. And it's something I recommend, but keep in mind its true purpose is through the practice of the physical, we learn to be able to dispel tension, we learn to be able to relax the body, we learn to be able to keep the spine straight, and we learn to be able to concentrate. One more thing we also learn is if we pay attention through our practice of Hatha Yoga, if you're practicing, but even if you're not, through your actions during the day, because Hatha yoga is merely a focus of physical action, physical posture. But all of us are doing some extension of Hatha yoga every day just through the movement of our body. Feel as your body is moving that it is energy that is moving in your body, that you are consciously directing your life force in your physical actions. And I'm bringing us back to this point, which will be repeated many times in these lessons. Awareness precedes control. And what we're aiming for in the study of our Raja Yoga, in the study of Kriya Yoga, which is the refinement of Raja Yoga, the epitome of Raja Yoga, we're aiming to learn to become aware of the movement of life force within the body. And in the movement of this life force, we're learning to become aware of consciousness behind the life force. There's a relationship. We have the physical world, we have the world of energy, of life force, and we also have the world of thought. And there's a relationship between all three of these, which we will explore in greater depth in these lessons. And to the degree that we can become aware of something, we can then learn to control it. So awareness precedes control. And when we control something, I don't mean it control in the sense of tension or, grim willpower, but the ability to direct our life force, the ability to direct our thoughts, the ability to direct our intentions to something higher. And in that ability to direct, there's concentration. In the ability to direct our thoughts and attitudes and life force, we do this as well in meditation. The one-pointed concentration of the mind upon the divine or some aspect of the divine is the definition of meditation. And the ability to do that allows us ultimately to transcend that dis-ease, to transcend that disharmony, and to bring these two together in union, which is the definition of yoga. Yoga is union, union of the little self with the larger self, union of the disparate parts of our personality into integration. This is what we'll discover as we begin to practice. I'll end our introduction by just mentioning again, start wherever you are and do whatever you can. It doesn't matter so much how long you meditate or how much you do these techniques or how much you study. The more important aspect is to do something. And if you take one small step, you can then test, how did that feel? Did that feel good? If it did, I'll do more. And you'll be guided. You don't feel impelled that you have to do something. You'll want to do something. And this was the approach that Paramahansa Yogananda took. He didn't say you must do this or you must do that. And this is what you find in so much of religion. Don't do this, and you must do this, and you must love God, and you must do X, Y, Z. And the heart asks, why? Why should I do that? And we can pick that same question up from the other side. It's because it's joyful. It's blissful. Paramahansa Yogananda said very nicely, he says, once you taste good cheese, you won't want to eat that stale cheese any longer. And so you'll find through the practice of Kriya Yoga, through the practice of Raja Yoga, through the practice of any of these yogas, you'll find that the results will attract you and you'll want to do more. Just start, and little by little you'll see for yourself through your own experience that all of these things we're going to be talking about in these lessons to come will prove to be true. So many blessings to you, and this is going to be a very fun journey. We're going to enjoy ourselves, and I'd like to share with you whatever blessings that I have. I send them to you and wish you the very, very best in your spiritual quest.